Hello, everyone. Tonight, we delve into the extraordinary existence and astounding fortitude of medieval peasants. These were the unsung heroes who, against all probability, found ways to endure some of the most frigid and unforgiving nights ever recorded. From improvised methods of insulation to the tactics of sleeping together for warmth, their narrative is one of sheer grit, cleverness, and resolve. Now, before we settle in, I'd appreciate it if you would like the video and consider subscribing, but only if you truly connect with the content I create here. And do let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what your local time is. I always find it incredible to see our global community assembling from all corners of the globe. All right, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle ambient sound, and let us embark on tonight's exploration together. When one considers medieval existence, images of jousting knights, opulent banquets, and lively fairs often come to mind. However, for the common peasant, winter was less concerned with amusement and more with the pressing question of survival through the night. It was not merely a season, it was an annual test of stamina, like a particularly harsh instructor who offered no second chances. Envision this. You reside in a small hut of mud and sticks, with walls so thin you could likely overhear a bird sneeze from outside. There is no insulation, no windows to speak of, save for a tiny opening filled with animal hide, and certainly no arguments with your siblings over the thermostat. The interior temperature of your dwelling was typically just a few courteous degrees warmer than the weather outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely a bit less frigid inside. Congratulations. The nights were the most difficult. Darkness consumed everything. The wind shrieked like a furious spirit, and the fire in the hearth flickered weakly, making its best effort, but primarily just toasting the feet of whoever sat nearest. If you were on the opposite side of the room, you might as well have been camping outdoors with inferior provisions. Clothing offered little relief either. Peasants did not possess elegant fur coats or goose-down quilts. You had a pair of coarsely spun wool tunics, perhaps a cloak with a suspicious scent of goat, and the hope that layering them might transform you into a sort of human bulb. Spoiler alert, it was not particularly effective. And as for nestling under soft blankets, forget it. Beds were frequently no more than sacks filled with hay or straw, perhaps with some old rushes added for good measure, and as a bonus, some fleas for additional companionship. Luxury. Thy name is the life of a medieval peasant. The cold was not just a source of discomfort, it was perilous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the general threat of freezing to death were persistent dangers, particularly for young children and the elderly. Each morning you awoke still breathing was deemed a small miracle, and frankly, it was something to celebrate, perhaps with a turnip that was slightly less frozen for breakfast. So yes, enduring a medieval winter was not about comfort. It was a matter of clenching your teeth, donning every scrap of fabric you possessed, huddling with your farm animals, and praying you would not wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows. And the true adventure was only just getting started. If you believe your apartment is drafty due to a window that won't shut correctly, medieval peasants would have a thing or two to say. Their dwellings were not just drafty, they were essentially enthusiastic wind tunnels with roofs. Most peasant homes were constructed using what historians gently refer to as wattle and daub. In simpler terms, sticks woven together like a massive basket and smeared with a quaint concoction of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. This was not an attempt to be vulgar. Dung was an inexpensive and adhesive insulator. Moreover, it was, shall we say, always in ready supply. These walls, regardless of how affectionately they were coated, stood little chance against a severe winter gale. The cold wind penetrated every fissure and gap, gleefully waltzing into the single-room homes, swirling about to ensure you never became too cozy. Privacy? Not a chance. Warmth? Not particularly. Character development? Absolutely. And then came the roofs. Thatched roofs certainly looked charming, but after several months of rain and snow, they would droop, leak, and sometimes admit the local wildlife. Nothing quite says a delightful evening like a squirrel descending onto your meal. Windows, if they were present at all, were comically small and typically covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so costly that even the lord of the manor likely couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane, and as for peasants, they were simply glad if the wind didn't tear the cowhide from the wall in the middle of a blizzard. To compound the problem, floors were often nothing more than packed earth. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud would ooze up from the ground, so you could technically say they had indoor water features, not that they appreciated them. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like walking across a frozen bog. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from the sides. It was a three-dimensional onslaught on your body's heat. But medieval peasants were not ones to complain. They filled gaps with moss, stuffed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled together closely, human insulation at its most primitive. Creativity, resilience, and a touch of sheep grease applied to the walls were often the only barriers between them and becoming medieval ice sculptures. Because if your house was crumbling and your primary defense against the weather involved mud and goat hair, well, you could at least find some humor in it, assuming your teeth weren't chattering too violently. As if the freezing air were not sufficient, medieval peasants also had to contend with a quiet adversary emerging from beneath them: the frozen earth itself. Floors in those times were not truly floors. They were merely slightly leveled areas of dirt inside your dwelling. If you were fortunate, someone might have spread some straw or old rushes to create an illusion of comfort. But be assured, you were sleeping just one thin layer away from the cold, hard ground. And that cold was unyielding. It permeated up from the earth like a malevolent specter, working its way through the straw, into your bones, and directly into your very being. If you dropped something on the floor during a winter night, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants attempted to combat this grim situation in a couple of ways. One approach was to layer thick mats of straw across the floor if you could afford it. Or more practically, if you could procure enough from your neighbor's field without being apprehended, you might have a reasonable insulating layer. However, straw quickly flattened, became moldy even faster, and provided an additional crunchy accompaniment to your already difficult nights. Some households would layer dried rushes on the dirt instead. Periodically, they would add fresh rushes on top without removing the old ones. Over time, this fostered a remarkable ecosystem of decomposing vegetation, fleas, and whatever enigmatic creatures chose to take up residence. It was essentially medieval carpet underlay if your carpet were alive, somewhat damp, and smelled of a wet dog. Beds, for those who possessed them, offered little solution. They were typically no more than wooden frames filled with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of comfortable mattresses, you had sharp, shifting, crunchy layers that did little to fend off the cold, radiating from the ground. Tossing and turning was not about finding comfort. It was a frantic, clumsy effort to maintain blood circulation and prevent one side of your body from freezing. The reality is, medieval peasants did not overcome the icy ground so much as they learned to exist uncomfortably above it. A restful night's sleep was not about dreams or softness. It was about waking with all your toes still present. And if you managed that, well, you were faring better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during the winter, it was not the roof, the walls, or even the valiant layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, resilient fire pit that acted as the sole true defense against the cold, the darkness, and the pervasive gloom of medieval life. At the heart of nearly every peasant dwelling was a simple fire. There was no fireplace with an elegant stone mantel, no tidy chimney to guide the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or a heap of stones, some partially burned logs, and enough smoke filling the room to make you question if you were slowly being cured like a ham. That's correct. Most homes lack chimneys. The smoke just sort of found its own way out. It would escape through small openings in the roof, gaps in the walls, or directly into your lungs if it felt particularly lethargic that evening. This was not ideal for breathing or for your general life expectancy. But on the positive side, it was highly effective at fumigating fleas and other unwelcome visitors. Who needs professional pest control when you are marinating in smoke 24 hours a day? The hearth was not just for warmth either. It was the kitchen, the source of light, and at times the medieval equivalent of a television. People would gather around the fire to tell stories, exchange gossip, or simply gaze into the flames because, honestly, there was little else to do after the sun went down. Keeping the fire going was not merely a good idea. It was essential. Allowing the fire to extinguish at night was like extending an invitation for the cold to enter and finish you off. Furthermore, reigniting a fire in winter was not as simple as striking a match. You had to use flint, steel, tinder, and more prayers than you had ever uttered before. Every member of the family had a responsibility, stoking the flames, monitoring the embers, adding peat, sticks, or, if you were fortunate, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a relentless struggle between human determination and the smothering cold that sought nothing more than to extinguish you. The hearth did not assure survival, but without it, survival was utterly impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often underwhelming little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the very heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than a shortage of ale, it was allowing the fire to die out during the night. Without that warm, flickering source of life, the cold would infiltrate faster than a tax collector after the harvest. And in the depths of winter, rekindling a fire from nothing was not just inconvenient. It could be fatal. Matches had not yet been invented. Lighters were a distant dream. Rekindling a fire required striking flint against steel, hoping for a single precious spark, and then carefully nurturing that spark with tender care and whatever dry tinder you hadn't already used days before. Imagine attempting this in the freezing darkness, half awake with numb fingers. Now add the sound of a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra encouragement. So peasants became resourceful. They banked the fire. No, not in a secure savings account. Banking involved meticulously covering the embers with a layer of ash just before going to bed. The ash served as an insulator, protecting the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If done correctly, you could wander over at dawn, poke the pile gently, add some fresh wood, and presto, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it incorrectly, well, mornings became significantly colder and much more irritable. Fire banking was a skill passed down from one generation to the next, like a treasured family recipe. Everyone had their own little tricks. Some swore by using only dry ash. Others maintained that a bit of moisture was crucial. Some packed the embers tightly, while others allowed them to breathe. You could easily ignite a medieval debate just by proposing a superior fire banking technique. It was the ancient equivalent of arguing over barbecue methods, only with slightly higher stakes for survival. Sometimes banking the fire was not enough. A fierce wind might slip through a crevice and extinguish it anyway, or a clumsy sheep might blunder into the hearth. Yes, that happened. That is why some families would take turns waking up during the night to check on the coals, essentially the medieval version of sleepwalking to adjust the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about conquering nature and more about gaining a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you awoke to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory, and enough to confront another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the saying, "the more the merrier," was not just for festivities. It was a winter survival strategy. When the fire dwindled and the frigid winds whistled through every opening, there was one reliable source of warmth, one another. And if that meant sleeping pressed against your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and perhaps a very bewildered goose, then so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy was not even a consideration. On the coldest nights, the objective was not comfort, but to avoid waking up frozen to the ground. Entire households would gather in the warmest part of the house, wrapped in whatever fragments of cloth they could find, forming what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human stack. Younger children were squeezed between their parents, grandparents were tucked under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel arrived unannounced, well, there was always space for one more. If you were fortunate, you slept in the middle, where body heat radiated from all directions. If you were unfortunate, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a walk-in freezer. And pity the person who moved too much during the night. A single shift for comfort could suddenly push Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you were now the family pariah. Sometimes even the bedding was communal, a shared straw mattress that gradually compacted under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And since hygiene was not exactly a priority back then, let's just say it was not the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you become less selective. Body heat was not just pleasant, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even suggested deliberately positioning the strongest, warmest individuals on the outside of the group like human barriers against the cold. Babies and the frail elderly were placed deep in the center, treated as the valuable little heat sources they were. This was not solely about survival, though. Over time, it became an integral part of daily existence, a form of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together fostered storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very intriguing conversations muffled beneath a shared woolen blanket. So, the next time your sibling takes your blanket or your dog monopolizes the bed, just remember, at least you're not competing for elbow room between a snoring uncle and a particularly critical goat. If you believe modern roommates are a handful, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter companions: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a heartbeat and a bit of body warmth. Bringing animals inside was not just a quaint village custom, it was essential for survival. Livestock produced heat, and in a poorly insulated dwelling where the wind howled louder than your own stomach, every small degree was significant. Furthermore, if your goat was sharing a wall with you, it was slightly less probable that it would be stolen by a neighbor in the middle of the night. Two problems solved with one smelly solution. At night, the house transformed into a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens would nest in corners, pigs would snort near the hearth, and cows would lounge comfortably against the walls, chewing their cud as if they were paying rent. It was far from glamorous. If you have ever been in a car during a summer trip with someone who neglected to shower, imagine that, but with a cow in winter and with absolutely nowhere else to go. The odors were legendary. By spring, the scent of a shared winter was quite potent. You did not need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild journey. But medieval peasants developed a selective sense of smell. They did not complain much because they understood a simple, uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had designated spots. Cows, being the largest and warmest, typically occupied the central area near the family. Goats were permitted closer for their warmth, and because, being goats, they would find a way inside regardless. Chickens roosted in the rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs were indifferent. They would settle wherever they pleased, likely right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your sleeping quarters with livestock had its risks. Imagine drifting into a peaceful sleep only to be abruptly awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a suitable perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the basic equation: cold kills, and cows provide warmth, whether they intend to or not. In the struggle against winter's icy grasp, a warm, slightly slobbery cow's breath was often the crucial factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion was not about appearances. It was about survival. Peasants were not browsing the latest styles. They were layering clothing as if preparing for a confrontation with death itself. The principle was straightforward. If you possessed it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, likely not very clean linen shirt. Over that, a heavier woolen tunic. then another, if you had one. Add some leggings that drooped at the knees, a coarse cloak over your shoulders, and if you were exceptionally fortunate, a mended sheepskin thrown on top like a prized possession. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and inserted them into wooden clogs. If the cold still managed to penetrate, well, you simply added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing these layers. Laundering your clothes in the middle of winter involved taking them to a frozen stream, breaking through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry, assuming it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt sculpture. Most peasants wisely concluded that smelling like a combination of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the accumulation of dirt and grease had an added benefit: insulation. That grimy layer sealed in body heat. It was like a medieval high-tech jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were highly valued items. A simple woolen cap could be the difference between surviving the night and waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often handmade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could find, sometimes resembling sad puppet costumes more than fashionable accessories. Children were especially bundled up until they looked like overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The aim was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, they were unheard of. Warmth was the true medieval status symbol. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember that medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and considering themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant's guide to life, dirt wasn't just something to be washed away, it was practically a survival instrument. As it happens, being grimy wasn't a sign of giving up on life. It was tactical, strategic, one might even say brilliant. You see, winter presented a very particular challenge: heat loss. Clean clothing, especially freshly washed linen, was surprisingly poor at keeping you warm. It was breathable, certainly, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and immediate regret, breathable wasn't exactly a desirable feature. That's where dirt played its part. As peasants went through day after day without washing their garments, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud would accumulate on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural coating filled the tiny gaps in the fabric, making the clothes more resistant to wind. It was a form of medieval weatherproofing, just with a stronger odor. Sure, you might smell like a goat that had lost a wager, but you were warm. In fact, some medieval people believed that washing too frequently in winter could actually make you ill. It was better to maintain that protective layer of holy filth. Bathing was infrequent, laundry even more so, and soap, when available, was reserved for significant events, like a visit from the bishop, or perhaps just before your demise. Adding to this strategy, peasants would layer their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You simply added your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking archive of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told the heroic tale of that time you slipped in the mud but managed to survive. To an outsider, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled as if they had completely abandoned hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal barrier against death by frostbite. It wasn't elegant, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell of flowers. Besides, in a world where nearly everyone had a strong odor, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion, it was function, and if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were succeeding at life. If you imagine medieval peasants spending their winters nestled in plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, you need to reconsider. The reality was a bit more primitive. And by primitive, I mean let's sleep on a heap of dead vegetation and hope for the best. Beds in the world of the medieval peasant were typically a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a large sack filled with straw, hay, or old rushes. That was it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly prickly mess that smelled faintly of a barnyard and disappointment. Every toss and turn during the night was accompanied by a delightful symphony of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp poke from a stray stalk. Some peasants even did away with the wooden frame entirely and just spread the straw directly on the dirt floor, creating a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses were not just uncomfortable, they were also temporary. Over time, the straw would flatten, grow mold, attract insects, and generally transform into a biological hazard. Changing the straw was a significant event, usually done a few times a year if you were conscientious, or whenever your bed began to move on its own. Rushes were a common alternative. These long grasses were spread thickly on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to conceal the overwhelming odor of daily life and livestock. Fresh rushes smelled pleasant for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled interior landscape, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else found its way inside. And let's not forget the bed companions. Fleas, lice, and other charming creatures loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were having the authentic medieval experience. Despite the difficulties, these simple beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a vital insulating layer against the frozen ground, and huddling together on top of them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its most basic. So next time you settle into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember that somewhere a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, smiling through a mouthful of missing teeth and thinking, "That must be nice." When you live in a dwelling made of sticks, mud, and hope, you quickly discover that winter drafts aren't just an annoyance, they're a personal affront. Medieval peasants didn't just combat the cold from the outside. They fought it from within their own homes, equipped with nothing more than whatever they could stuff into the gaps. And believe me, there were plenty of gaps. Walls would warp, mud would crumble, and thatch would sag. The cold seemed to find new entry points every night, like a mischievous spirit with a vendetta. Sealing up the house became a form of art. Peasants would fill gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, pliable, or remotely insulating, it was shoved into a hole somewhere. Some particularly persistent individuals would apply extra layers of mud and dung to the exterior of their walls as an annual winter task. Imagine standing in the freezing cold, smearing cold manure onto your own home while thinking, "This is fine. This is a luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another area of concern. Thatch, while inexpensive and abundant, was not exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare pieces of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of sheer desperation, chunks of sod taken from the nearest field. Every home eventually began to resemble a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors and windows, if you had them, were a stroke of luck. But even then, they were little more than wooden planks held in place by iron nails and sheer determination. Window openings were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block the worst drafts and add a bonus scent of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a struggle between human resourcefulness and the relentless, sneaky cold. One moment you were warm, the next a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, startling you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent condition, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the harshest winters nature could muster. one muddy handful at a time. When the cold is sharp enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a strategy. Don't even bother pretending everyone will sleep at once. Instead, they adopted a survival tactic that would make any modern military leader proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't a highly organized system with whistles and inspections. It was much simpler and far more desperate. Half of the household would stay awake, tending the fire and sealing any stray drafts, while the other half would curl up under thin blankets and hay, trying to get a few precious hours of semi-frozen rest. The fire required constant vigilance. Left unattended, it would diminish, and as we've discussed, restarting it was as easy as persuading a stubborn donkey to dance. So, someone always had to be on ember duty, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally somewhat warm, families would rotate the responsibility. You would doze for a few hours, get nudged awake, then shuffle over to the hearth to poke, prod, and coax the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation was anything but glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no midnight snacks, and definitely no 5 more minutes snooze alarms. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing annoyance toward whoever snored the loudest during your watch. Children old enough to hold a stick were put to work, learning early that in winter everyone contributed or risked freezing. Grandparents sometimes remained by the fire longer, both due to their experience and because, frankly, arthritis made the act of lying down and getting up again a monumental task. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving about, animals rustling, the wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp elbow from a sibling who rolled over too hard. Achieving quality sleep was a miracle. Yet, despite the fatigue, the system was effective. Sleeping in shifts ensured that there was always a pair of eyes and cold, reluctant hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So the next time you complain about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting at a smoky fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really all that necessary. After all, you know it's cold when you have to consciously manage how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just combat the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even modified the way they breathed to survive the night. The issue was straightforward. Deep, open-mouthed breathing drew icy air directly into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could be fatal, faster than you could say a prayer, that was a risk no one was willing to take. So, peasants mastered the art of what one might call survival breathing. Instead of taking in large gasps of air as if they had just completed a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most critically, through the nose. The principle was to gently warm the incoming air before it reached their lungs. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was preferable to coughing yourself to an early grave by February. If you accidentally inhaled a large mouthful of cold air, you had just earned yourself a week of hacking up what felt like pieces of your soul, with no doctors available, and your grandmother treating you with hot onion tea and fervent prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warming barrier. Of course, this also meant you would wake up with a damp, slightly soggy patch of fabric clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it was better than freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these techniques from a young age. Parents would reprimand little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing instructions, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to a particularly gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were a form of character building on an entirely different level. At night, nestled in straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational sayings. In the grand playbook of survival, it wasn't the most conspicuous strategy, but it was effective. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the perpetual struggle against the medieval winter, peasants found an unexpected secret weapon: a full stomach. It turns out that one of the most effective ways to combat the cold wasn't another scratchy woolen cloak. It was consuming a hearty, heavy meal right before bed. Calories equated to warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it generated its own heat in the process. This is basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a substantial meal, produce internal heat, and perhaps, just perhaps, survive until morning without becoming a peasant-shaped ice sculpture. So, what did medieval peasants eat before a long, freezing night? Imagine thick stews, rich with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were also crucial lifesavers: oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were particularly fortunate, say after a festival or a generous slaughter, you might even have a piece of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage added to the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the modern social media sense. There was no delicate plating, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your stomach like a friendly weight, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a large quantity, it was about eating intelligently. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady release of warmth. Fatty foods were especially valued, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns more slowly than lean meat. A stomach full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard represented the pinnacle of medieval winter luxury. Parents ensured that even the most selective children ate well. It didn't matter if little Thomas disliked turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night regretting that you hadn't. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime meals had their own drawbacks. You might be warmer, but you also risked a night of vivid, bizarre dreams fueled by a stomach desperately trying to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely, because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin-starred meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing mission to see another frosty sunrise. Long before the invention of electric blankets and sophisticated heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to be inventive to find a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that is how the humble haybox and the ever-stylish heated stone became the unsung heroes of winter. Let's begin with the haybox. It sounds primitive, and it certainly was, but the concept was pure brilliance. Peasants would take a solid wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, place it in the haybox, cover it, and it would remain hot enough for a late-night meal without the risk of having to relight the fire. Essentially, a medieval slow cooker. But peasants didn't limit this to just food. They discovered that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better: rocks. This marked the beginning of the heated stone era. Before retiring for the night, someone, likely whichever unfortunate child lost the family disagreement, would select a flat stone and place it in the heart of the hearth fire. After heating it until it was almost too hot to handle, a fine balance between helpful and a third-degree burn, they would retrieve it using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, placed in an old piece of cloth, or put into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to combat the frozen earth. Of course, there were dangers. If you didn't wrap the stone correctly, you could end up with a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say that winter injuries weren't always from slipping on ice. But when everything went as planned, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles hanging from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not seem glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a small miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth was not just where you prepared dinner. It was practically a member of the family. A moody, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, certainly, but still absolutely vital for survival, especially when it was time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the greater your chances of waking up unfrozen. This meant that sleeping arrangements were less about personal comfort and more about strategic placement. Infants, the elderly, and anyone who was ill or frail received priority for the prime spots. Parents, older children, and more robust adults would arrange themselves outward from there, like layers of human insulation. Being given a spot near the fire was not just an act of kindness, it was basic survival arithmetic. Babies were delicate heat sources, and elders were valuable keepers of family lore, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with optimal warmth was essential, but it wasn't all about comfortably toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering alarmingly. Too far, and you were essentially camping in a deep freeze. It was a delicate balance. Stay close enough to enjoy the fire's glow, but not so close that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now resembled a half-cooked meal. The fire also did not distribute warmth evenly. It primarily heated the people directly in front of it, while everyone else vied for the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards competing for a ray of sunlight. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably tap on it. Pets and livestock, of course, also vied for position. A dog might squeeze itself between you and the fire, its tail wagging perilously close to the open flames. Chickens sometimes perched precariously on hearthstones, clucking softly through the night like tiny feathered guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of the glowing embers was a small promise. You are still alive. You are still warm. For now. And so peasants would drift into a restless sleep, soothed by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one endured the winter alone unless they wished to become a very chic frozen statue by January. Survival was not merely a family matter, it was a community effort, a chaotic, muddy, noisy collaboration where everyone's warmth and life were dependent on everyone else's. The peasants understood that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only achieve so much. If your neighbor's house fell dark, you took notice. If the smoke from Old Tom's hearth suddenly ceased to rise into the sky, someone would go to investigate. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might have been part of it, but because community was synonymous with survival. Villages had informal winter watchdogs, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work in the fields but could monitor who was coughing excessively, who hadn't appeared to trade at the market in several days, or whose home seemed a little too quiet in the morning frost. These individuals were the medieval equivalent of a neighborhood watch, without the reflective vests and with a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was nearly a state of emergency. A good neighbor would hurry over with a glowing coal wrapped in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant accommodating an extra 4 people in an already packed space, but it was preferable to discovering frozen friends when the spring thaw arrived. Communal food supplies also played a part. During particularly harsh winters, villages would sometimes pool their remaining salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was a form of grim charity. No one had much, but a few shared meals could be the difference between making it to spring and not. Even children grasped the stakes. They assisted in delivering wood, sharing embers, and carrying urgent messages when someone required help. No one was too young or too weary when winter was at the door. Certainly, medieval villages were not all harmony and affection. Feuds occurred, disputes over land, goats, or who had borrowed whose good cooking pot never truly disappeared. But when the nights turned lethally cold, old animosities were often quietly set aside. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow you might be the one in need of rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village transformed into one large, resilient family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often amusing, always fiercely resolved to endure together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants confronted the brutal cold of winter, they didn't just add more cloaks or stoke the fire, they prayed extensively. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire dwindled to sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a bit of divine assistance. Faith was not just a Sunday practice back then, it was integrated into every frozen breath. Before settling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering quick prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof secure, and their toes attached by mourning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were the frontline defense against winter. Saint Blaise, for instance, was invoked to protect against throat ailments, not a trivial concern when a single mouthful of icy air could lead to coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the cheerful gift-giver of later folklore. He was also called upon to protect households from sudden disaster during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions were closely intertwined with daily survival. Some families would sprinkle a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would ward off evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others would mark their doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, praying for warmth and good fortune to enter their homes. Candles also played a role. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most devout old woman in the village, were sometimes kept alight throughout the night, a flickering entreaty against the cold darkness that clawed at the walls. And, of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just help us get through this night, I promise I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps taking our turnips. Faith was not some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent dialogue. The peasants were not asking for luxury, just survival, a little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen hold on their small villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow saw them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the resourcefulness, prayers, and resilience that medieval peasants directed at winter, the stark reality was that sometimes it was not enough. And when winter prevailed, it didn't just claim a few unlucky individuals. It took entire families, whole villages, making them vanish into silence beneath a heavy blanket of snow and ice. Some winters were especially harsh, like the notorious Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains ruined crops, livestock perished from hunger, and freezing temperatures transformed an already difficult existence into a slow, grueling catastrophe. People were so desperate that tales were whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the most dreadful instances, one another. Failing to keep the fire alive was not just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's modest warmth, families would huddle together one last time. Neighbors would sometimes discover entire households in the spring, their bodies still locked in a frozen embrace, as if they were trying to share a little more heat until the very end. The houses themselves could give way under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof collapsing in the middle of a frozen night was not just disastrous, it was often fatal. Dragging oneself through thigh-deep snow to seek shelter from neighbors was not a guarantee of safety either, especially if those neighbors were already at their limit. Disease also thrived in the cold. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes became breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lethal infections. A simple cough in December could easily lead to a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet terror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, and even ears would blacken and die while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim mark of honor that declared, "I survived, but winter claimed a part of me." Yet what is most haunting is not just the death, but the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter some among them would not live to see the thaw. Death was not unforeseen, it was just another visitor at the door, cloaked in frost, awaiting its turn. Even amidst the bitter cold and constant danger, medieval peasants carried on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as one ember remained in the hearth, one breath hung in the frozen air, there was still a battle worth fighting. When we reflect on medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of perpetual winters, it is easy to focus only on their struggles, the chapped hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-filled huts. But concealed beneath all that hardship is something far more potent, a legacy of raw, unyielding ingenuity and unbreakable resilience. They lacked central heating, thermal jackets, and comfortable memory foam mattresses. They did not even have the assurance that they would survive until spring. But what they did possess, and what they bequeathed, was the blueprint for endurance. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every carefully banked fire, every moss-filled wall gap was a testament to human creativity under duress. Confronted with insurmountable odds, they did not succumb to despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from one another, and from the harsh lessons taught by each brutal winter. Their communities were founded on more than shared territory. They were built on shared survival. They taught one another to care for the sick, to pool resources when food was scarce, and to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the principle that no one defeats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a form of endurance. They integrated prayers into their daily lives, not merely out of fear, but out of hope, a fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would return and life would manage to push through the frozen earth. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous triumphs, surviving one more night, one more storm, future generations flourished. Increment by frozen increment, they propelled humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant aspirations. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are invisibly woven into the fabric of our lives today. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every leisurely winter evening spent with a cup of tea under soft lighting. All of it is the culmination of countless medieval peasants refusing to yield to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, perhaps give a thought to them, the nameless, courageous ones who transformed shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one steadfast heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn did not enter the world with a crown upon her head or armies at her command. Born around 1501, probably at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a driven diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with influential family connections. In the broader context of Tudor society, Anne's birth caused barely a stir. Yet from these humble origins, something remarkable was beginning to grow, a life that would one day alter the course of English history. From a young age, Anne was distinguished not by her fortune, but by her intellect. She was intelligent, vibrant, and by all reports, captivating. Acknowledging her potential, her family sent her to the continent, where her education truly commenced. First, she attended Margaret of Austria in the splendid court of the Netherlands, an opportunity few English girls could imagine. There, Anne mastered the arts of diplomacy, refined etiquette, and the delicate intricacies of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly honed. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, and wit. While other young women were perfecting their needlework, Anne was mastering conversation, intrigue, and the art of holding attention without ever appearing to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was a rare commodity, a woman who could match the sophistication of continental courtiers while possessing the ambition of a rising English family. She was not a conventional beauty. Even her admirers acknowledged that. But she was striking. Dark eyes that shone with intelligence, a quick, melodious voice, and a manner of moving that hinted at a purpose just barely hidden beneath layers of courtly poise. Anne did not just enter a room. She altered its center of gravity. At a time when a woman's destiny was often determined by her birth and marriage, Anne refused to fade quietly into the background. She had witnessed the power that charm and intellect could command in foreign courts, and she planned to apply that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, clever, ambitious, and untested, but history was already starting to move around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer merely Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a participant in a much larger game, one that would soon involve the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn came back to the English court, she was unlike anyone the aristocracy had encountered before. In a world of pale-skinned, demure English roses, Anne was a force of nature, electric, unpredictable, and impossible to overlook. Her dark hair, assertive eyes, and quick, sharp intellect distinguished her from the gentle, compliant ladies who populated the court of King Henry VIII. Initially, she fulfilled the role expected of her as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence shone like a flame too bright to be extinguished. She danced with grace, spoke French with the fluency of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dared to show. Men took notice. Women whispered. The court quietly buzzed about the remarkable Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she attracted the most perilous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no novice at flirtation. His court was a landscape of whispered promises and clandestine affairs. But Anne was different. She did not swoon at his compliments or fall readily into his arms as so many others had. She teased, she challenged, she declined. Henry, a man accustomed to immediate admiration, was enthralled. The more Anne kept him at a distance, the more deeply he fell for her. Letters were exchanged between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, and desire. Henry offered her the position of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial role at court. Anne, astoundingly, refused. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to history. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so bold that it shocked the court. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was cherished by the people and fiercely defended by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be challenged for Henry to claim Anne. But Anne did not waver. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens exerted soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She understood that ambition was a perilous game, but it was a game she was determined to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her decision, not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny, and England's, forever. What started as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn quickly escalated into a national crisis. Henry was not just infatuated, he was obsessed. And in his obsession, he was prepared to dismantle everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anne encountered a minor obstacle, namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and strong-willed, refused to step aside quietly. She had been Henry's loyal wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the legitimate queen. Divorce was not just scandalous, it was nearly inconceivable. But Henry was resolute. He convinced himself and attempted to convince everyone else that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had previously been married to his brother, Arthur. The fact that the Pope had granted a special dispensation for their union years earlier was now irrelevant. Henry insisted that his soul was in peril unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, was wise enough not to seem overly eager. She kept herself just beyond his grasp, alternately fostering Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was carefully considered. She wasn't just aiming for marriage, she was positioning herself to become the Queen of England. The court descended into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly sought Anne's favor, recognizing the shifting tides of power. Others remained fiercely loyal to Queen Catherine, appalled at the thought of Anne replacing her. Diplomats sent desperate letters to Rome. Foreign monarchs issued threats of retaliation. Henry's own advisers grew uneasy, sensing the instability beneath them. As months stretched into years, Henry's frustration mounted. He flooded the Pope with petitions, directed his lawyers to find legal loopholes, and slowly began to accept that the Church would not yield easily. Catherine had powerful supporters, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most influential man in Europe. Still, Henry persisted, ignoring advice, tradition, and increasingly, the law itself. His courtship of Anne had evolved into something much larger than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very fabric of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just winning a king's heart, she was pulling an entire kingdom into unknown territory. A dangerous game had commenced, and there was no going back. After nearly 7 torturous years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic turmoil, Anne Boleyn's audacious gamble succeeded. In January 1533, she secretly wed Henry VIII, a bold act considering he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the pinnacle of her life, but the mood was far from universally celebratory. The people of London observed with weary expressions. Some cheered, while others whispered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many questioned whether this new queen, with her French sophistication and bold spirit, was a blessing or a curse. Anne began her queenship not as a cherished figure, but as a tempest. Unlike Catherine, who represented traditional English values of modesty and piety, Anne was brilliant, provocative, and politically astute. She wore vibrant colors, commanded the court with her sharp mind, and made powerful enemies with astonishing speed. Her position, though seemingly firm, was also frighteningly fragile. Everything depended on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir. Anne understood this as well as anyone. She was no longer just Henry's lover. She was the hope for a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were optimistic, convinced the child would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she concealed her immense disappointment with grace, asserting that the next child would undoubtedly be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His gaze, once filled with adoration, now held flickers of doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's influence shone brightly. She reformed the English court in her own style, elevating her family to unprecedented status and becoming the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil typically reserved for kings. Her power was immense. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Courtiers realigned their allegiances to gain her approval. The once devout Henry began to officially steer England away from Rome, establishing the Church of England with himself as its head, all so that Anne's crown could not be challenged. Yet even amidst her success, dark clouds were forming. Friends whispered behind their hands. Rivals circled, waiting. And Henry, capricious and restless, was already starting to look past the brilliant woman who had reshaped a kingdom for him. Anne had secured the throne, but retaining it would require more than charm, ambition, or even love. Anne Boleyn had risen higher than almost any woman of her era, but the higher the ascent, the more severe the fall. Almost from the moment she wore the crown, the fractures in her world started to appear. At the core of Anne's difficulties was the immense pressure to deliver a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though intelligent and healthy, was not the son upon whom Henry VIII had staked his dynastic ambitions, and time was running out. Anne experienced several pregnancies in rapid succession, but each was followed by sorrow, miscarriages that left her physically drained and emotionally devastated. Each lost child weakened the foundation she had so carefully constructed. Henry, once deeply devoted, began to distance himself. His disappointment created a chasm between them. Anne, never one to endure suffering quietly, argued, made demands, and fought to maintain her position. But Henry, a man who valued obedience as much as beauty, grew weary of her sharpness, her defiance, the very passion that had once captivated him. Beyond the royal apartments, enemies were gathering like predators. Many nobles who had grudgingly accepted Anne's rise now openly plotted her demise. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave Anne for what they perceived as theft and blasphemy. Even commoners spoke against her, calling her the Great Whore and blaming her for the break with Rome and the heavy-handed reforms that ensued. And then emerged Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything Anne was not, Jane captured Henry's wandering eye just as Anne's influence started to fade. Where Anne had impressed him with brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing submission. It was a perilous change, and Anne, ever perceptive, recognized it. She attempted to regain her standing, showering Henry with attention, promising more sons, and pleading for his patience. But the king, ever changeable, had already started to envision a life without the woman for whom he had once dismantled a kingdom. Anne's political adversaries, including Thomas Cromwell, a former ally, sensed the shifting tide. They began to lay the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly amassing accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had so skillfully played the dangerous game of ambition was now losing her footing. Anne had won her crown through cunning and courage, but in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past successes counted for little. Only new achievements mattered, and Anne's enemies were preparing their attack. The queen, who had shattered a kingdom, would soon discover how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne Boleyn's adversaries did not assail her with armies or weapons. They came with whispers, secrets, and meticulously crafted falsehoods. In the private chambers of the court, betrayal was fomenting, silent, patient, and lethal. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's staunchest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their partnership had been founded on shared ambition, but now their objectives conflicted. Anne sought reforms to aid the poor and curb the power of avaricious nobles. Cromwell desired stability, favor with Henry, and no disruptions. Anne's audacity had made her a liability, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had soured into irritation, suspicion, and cold indifference. Anne had few genuine friends remaining. Even her charm, once her most potent weapon, now clashed with the court's desire for a gentler, more compliant queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and strategic, waited just out of view, the ideal contrast to Anne's diminishing fire. It was Cromwell who acted first, aware that Henry was restless and seeking an escape, but lacking a convenient justification. Cromwell proposed a solution. What if Anne could be eliminated not by divorce, which would embarrass Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were outlandish, monstrous: adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud, brilliant queen, was portrayed as a betrayer, a temptress, a menace to the very crown she had once redefined. Cromwell meticulously compiled evidence, extracting confessions under duress and twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges were nonsensical, riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, the truth was whatever the king required it to be. Anne, feeling the trap closing in, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was futile. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to look at her. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gate closed behind her, she understood the reality. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn caught in the brutal game she had once played so adeptly. Betrayal had determined her fate. And now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn awaited the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London before a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their titles and wealth to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and observant, ready to eliminate the woman who had once altered the destiny of England. The charges against her were staggering: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason, and conspiracy against the king. In another context, such accusations against a queen would have been unimaginable. But here they were mere theatrics, a grim spectacle designed to give Henry VIII exactly what he desired: Anne's downfall, shrouded in a thin pretense of legality. Anne defended herself with the same passion that had once captured Henry's heart. She denied every charge with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that amazed even her adversaries. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all in vain. The verdict had been reached long before Anne entered the courtroom. The trial was a performance for the court and the public, a public dismantling of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, delivered damning words. Dates and locations contradicted one another. The evidence was weak when it existed at all. But the truth was now irrelevant. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused alongside her were sentenced to death as well. Anne was to be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the standard traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely resilient. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, stating that she was ready to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court breathed a sigh of relief. The storm that was Anne, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then, they did not comprehend. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was brought back to the Tower of London, not as the victorious queen who had once ruled England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting her execution. Yet even in the face of her end, Anne refused to break down. In the cold, reverberating halls of the Tower, Anne readied herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice firm. She confessed to no crimes, as she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she declared, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy to her young daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who remained loyal, wept privately. Anne consoled them rather than the other way around. She joked grimly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor lay the resilient spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, displayed no mercy. He had already shifted his focus to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was set, Henry was planning his next marriage. For Anne, this final act of betrayal from the man who had once dismantled a kingdom for her must have been the most profound wound. On May 18, 1536, Anne was informed she would die the following morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had brought her to this point. Henry, in a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to perform the execution. Faster, cleaner, and less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, perhaps intended more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed meticulously for her final moment. a dark gray gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle underneath, colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, prepared to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist enveloped the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was imminent, but her story was only just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked up to the scaffold erected within the walls of the Tower of London. A small assembly had gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all in silence, as if even the stone walls were holding their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning air. She appeared thinner than she had at court, her face pale but serene. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she met death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its foundations. She spoke briefly, selecting her final words with care. She made no accusations. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had forsaken her. In those last moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage astonished even those who had come to witness her demise. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes raised to the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained motionless. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was gone. She was buried swiftly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, placed in an arrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold was now left to disappear without ceremony. Yet Anne's story did not conclude in that cold grave. Her daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once been a disappointment to a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would witness the flourishing of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp intellect, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn altered the course of England forever. Her ambition contributed to the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall demonstrated to the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet, through her bloodline, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy shone brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn achieved a form of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible mark on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies were simmering with the intensity of a pot left too long on a blazing fire. The relationship with Britain, once viewed as the proud motherland, had deteriorated into resentment, suspicion, and mounting anger. It did not begin with tea. Years before, the Stamp Act had infuriated colonists by levying taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. This was followed by the Townshend Acts, which taxed necessities like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, enacted thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no voice, was like another spark falling on dry tinder. Initially, the anger was expressed through formal petitions and passionate pamphlets. Colonial assemblies produced official protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers such as Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with fervent arguments about liberty and rights. But as time passed, the frustration evolved into something more profound, a slow realization that Britain was not listening. Worse, Britain was indifferent. Many colonists held on to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned with enough force, Parliament would revoke the taxes. And sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after vigorous colonial protest. But every minor victory was followed by new laws, new taxes, new affronts. It was not about the money. It never truly was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What enraged the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without their consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, and governed like distant properties rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the center of the resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive and fiery group of patriots, grew louder and more audacious. In 1770, tensions erupted into violence when British soldiers fired upon unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a relic of the past. By 1773, the colonies were on the verge of open conflict. A final insult would push them into open defiance, and it arrived not in the form of soldiers, new laws, or armies, but in the quiet, seemingly benign shape of crates filled with tea. The colonists did not know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would be forever changed. In 1773, Parliament made a grave error in judgment. Believing the American colonies would passively accept cheaper tea, they enacted the Tea Act, a law intended to rescue the struggling British East India Company and, incidentally, reaffirm Britain's authority to tax the colonies. On the surface, it seemed like a favorable deal. The Tea Act permitted the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing middlemen, reducing prices, and offering a luxury item at a discount, a few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, because the issue was not the cost of the tea, but the principle it represented. The Tea Act kept the despised tax on tea firmly in place. To accept the tea, even at a lower price, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. For many Americans, this was inconceivable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to defend for over a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread rapidly through the colonies. Merchants were furious, seeing their businesses threatened by a monopoly that would undermine local commerce. Patriots were enraged by the underlying message. The Crown still believed it could act with impunity. In Boston, the response was particularly vehement. Already a city marked by the Boston Massacre and years of economic struggle, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was: a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a point of honor, a test of loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings grew in size. Newspaper columns blazed with impassioned rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by figures such as Samuel Adams, organized boycotts, pledging that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or consumed on American soil. Across the colonies, ships carrying the contentious tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear: we will not be bought. But in Boston, circumstances took a different turn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbor, and remained there, refusing to depart. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A stalemate ensued, as taut as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same. As the British tea ships remained stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor, the city itself became a volatile situation. Each day that passed without a resolution heightened the tension. Boston was not just resisting, it was preparing for a confrontation. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angered colonists debated their next move. The Sons of Liberty, led by passionate voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, quickly organized the resistance. They posted public notices urging citizens to boycott British tea and held boisterous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each gathering intensified the situation. The Old South Meeting House became the hub of the resistance. Thousands packed into the wooden hall, their breath clouding the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were delivered, and tempers flared. Each vote against unloading the tea was another strike against British authority. But while the people of Boston were united, time was running out. British law stipulated that imported goods like tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would confiscate the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be conceded. It was no longer just about the tea. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, remained firm. He refused to allow the tea ships to leave without unloading their cargo, insisting that the law be followed, colonial outrage notwithstanding. To him, yielding meant acknowledging that mobs, not monarchs, governed the colonies. Boston's standoff became a public spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was imminent. You could sense it in the air, that cold, sharp feeling before a storm when the world seems to hold its breath. All it would take was one spark to set off an explosion. And somewhere amidst the crowded streets and hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly being made, a plan that would resonate across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, began gray and cold over Boston, a city poised on the brink of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking time bombs. Now the final deadline had come. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo and British troops could be brought in to enforce the law. Everyone was aware of it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea was brought ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists permitted it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty, would be undone. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists filled the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked for miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so crowded that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the passionate speeches echoing from within. Samuel Adams, the powerful voice of rebellion, chaired the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to condemn the Tea Act, to protest against tyranny, and to call for immediate action. But even amidst the defiance, a heavy sense of uncertainty lingered. What could be done without triggering outright war? How could they stop the tea without inviting brutal retaliation? As the afternoon progressed, riders brought grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson was unyielding. The ships would not be permitted to leave without unloading. The tea would be confiscated, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced. The crowd seethed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to tremble with its force. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and uttered the words that signaled the end of the debate. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." A simple sentence, but everyone understood its meaning. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war cry pierced the growing darkness. The signal. Men quickly disguised themselves, smearing soot on their faces and donning blankets and feathers in a rough imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about deceiving anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message that no one could misinterpret. The deadline had passed. Boston would respond, not with words, but with defiance. As twilight settled over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to come alive. Figures moved through the shadows, ordinary men wrapped in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some decorated with feathers. They were not attempting to fool anyone into thinking they were actual Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of casting off their old identities and taking a stand as something new, something fierce. In dozens they proceeded to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were anchored. The harbor water was cold and dark, thick with the sharp chill of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken disorder. This was not a riot. It was a mission executed with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists boarded the ships, easily overpowering the few crew members still on board. The sailors were unharmed. They were simply moved aside and watched in silence as the operation commenced. Men split open the wooden chests with skilled strikes, the fragrant scent of fresh tea filling the cold night air. Others hoisted the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the quiet waters of the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and thrown overboard until the black water was swirling with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent and awestruck. British guards stationed nearby did not intervene. Whether this was due to confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating the violence remains uncertain. Some reports suggest that even among British loyalists there was an understanding that something had shifted, and it would not be stopped that night. The discipline was remarkable. No cargo was stolen. No one plundered the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were common, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was finished, the harbor looked like a great swirling cauldron filled with splintered chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp aroma of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange, bittersweet scent. The task was complete. Silently, the men melted back into the night, disappearing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the undeniable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates floated in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot, a brawl, or a drunken display. It was something far more unusual, an act of cold, calculated defiance carried out under the cover of darkness. The harbor was turned into a giant swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in large mats on the water, turning it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, tried to scoop handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be reprimanded by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one was to benefit from that night's work. This was about principle, pure and simple. The town awoke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread rapidly, by word of mouth, letters, and broadsides. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had occurred, and opinions quickly divided. Among patriots there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had challenged the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates there was shock. To them, the destruction of property was reckless and dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line from which they could not return? Governor Thomas Hutchinson fumed in his residence, furious not only at the destruction, but at the message it conveyed. If the king's authority could be so openly defied in Boston, where else might rebellion ignite? British officials were taken aback. They had anticipated protests, boycotts, perhaps another riot like those that had occurred over the Stamp Act. They had not expected organized, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The captains of the ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, could only watch powerlessly as their cargo vanished beneath the waves. In the official records, the night's loss would be estimated at over $10,000 British pounds, a significant sum. But the real loss was not measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile belief that Britain still governed its colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper emerged, a shared, undeniable truth. The era of peaceful protest was coming to an end. A confrontation was imminent, and Boston was prepared. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the reaction was swift and severe. To British officials, it was not merely a protest. It was an act of rebellion, an open, defiant challenge to royal authority that could not be tolerated. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with rage. Parliament, already exasperated by years of colonial insubordination, erupted in fury. They demanded retribution not just for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The outcome was a series of laws so harsh they were soon dubbed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first measure came quickly, the Boston Port Act. In one decisive move, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's thriving harbor, the economic heart of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order was restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade ceased. Goods and supplies dwindled. Boston, once bustling and noisy, fell quiet, its docks unnervingly still. But the punishment did not end there. The Massachusetts Government Act deprived the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it directly under the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, a clear message that British authorities were above the law. And to ensure the colonies understood that force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to control. The message was clear. Rebellion would be suppressed. Liberty was a luxury the Crown would no longer afford. But Parliament's heavy-handed approach had an unforeseen consequence. Instead of intimidating the other colonies into compliance, it enraged them. News of Boston's plight, its port closed, its people facing starvation under martial law, stirred profound sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies streamed into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of solidarity, and secret meetings began to draw the once disparate colonies closer together. What had been a Massachusetts issue was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had intended to make an example of them. Instead, they had made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering in isolated areas, now began to spread from colony to colony, and there would be no easy way to extinguish them. The punishment of Boston sent tremors far beyond the rocky coast of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage evolved into something far more perilous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had behaved like distant relatives, quarreling and competing, divided by geography, religion, and commercial interests. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and revoked Massachusetts's self-governance, Americans throughout the continent understood that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was immediate. Colonists dispatched wagons filled with food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings seethed with anger. Newspaper printers worked tirelessly to disseminate the news. The struggle was no longer Boston's alone. It belonged to everyone. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented occurred. The First Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to coordinate a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together as the leaders of a movement that was expanding daily. Their objective, at least officially, was not yet complete independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the former relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the formal debates and carefully crafted petitions, a deeper realization was taking hold. The colonies could no longer afford to stand alone. At the Congress, they agreed to a comprehensive boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual support in the event of further British aggression, and they made it clear that an attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses across the continent, ordinary people began to use words that had once been uttered only in private: unity, resistance, liberty. By bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had thought it would quell rebellion. Instead, It had forged the colonies into something far more formidable, a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to see themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just stirring, they were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to halt it. The night the tea was thrown into Boston Harbor, it was not just crates that were lost. It was the illusion that the American colonies could remain loyal subjects indefinitely. The Boston Tea Party ignited a spark that no king, no army, no distant parliament could ever extinguish. In the months that followed, that spark spread like wildfire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions transformed into open defiance. Town militias began to drill publicly. Storehouses were filled with powder and shot. Men who had once raised their glasses to King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbroken. The more Britain attempted to tighten its control, the more the colonies slipped from its grasp. Every ship that sailed past the closed, silent harbor of Boston was a quiet reminder that tyranny had met its match in American defiance. When Parliament enacted the Intolerable Acts, they intended to make an example of Boston to intimidate the other colonies into submission. Instead, they had created a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized their fates were intertwined. The resistance was no longer about tea, it was about survival, identity, and freedom. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached a critical point outside Boston. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to confiscate colonial weapons encountered armed farmers, ordinary men prepared to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired, a direct line back to the moment when men chose principle over profit and cast a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party demonstrated to the world that revolution does not always begin with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly, with a small group of determined people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists were not just rejecting a tax. They were rejecting an empire. And though the path ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing became clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. Long before the Great Pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian cities teemed with life, before Stonehenge stood against the heavens, there was Corral. Tucked away in the arid valleys of coastal Peru, Corral rose in silent splendor nearly 5,000 years ago, then vanished into almost complete obscurity, engulfed by the sands and lost to history. For centuries, the world was unaware of its existence. The Supe Valley, where Corral once flourished, seems at first an improbable location for civilization to emerge. The landscape is arid, desolate, the river little more than a thin silver ribbon winding through rocks and dust. To most observers, it appeared inhospitable, a place forsaken by life. Yet it was here, amidst the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest great cities was formed. Corral was not just a cluster of scattered huts or a temporary trading outpost. It was a planned city covering over 150 acres, filled with pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial spaces. It possessed scale, purpose, and vision, a complex society that blossomed centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones into their own pyramids. The people of Corral accomplished this without the wheel, without a written language, and without metal tools. They constructed massive structures from stone and earth using only ingenuity, communal effort, and the sheer force of human will. Yet for thousands of years, Corral's existence remained a mystery. Even when travelers came across the strange, weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural landforms, mere hills shaped by the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had identified as the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they discovered buried in the dust of time would rewrite the story of the Americas and compel the world to reconsider what it thought it knew about the origins of civilization itself. Corral had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking once more, whispering of a peaceful, intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder in a land where life itself seemed an impossibility. And this was only the beginning of their narrative. At first impression, the Supa Valley appears to be a place where life would find it difficult to survive. Strong winds blow across vast expanses of sand and stone. The sun beats down relentlessly, parching the earth and baking the landscape into cracked, fragile sheets. Water is in short supply, the river a winding thread struggling for existence. To the untrained eye, it is a desolate wasteland, barren, empty, and forgotten by the gods. But the people of Corral perceived something different. They did not see a desert to be feared. They saw a canvas to be molded. They recognized the river, however small, as the source of all possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer resolve, they transformed this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their initial triumph was agriculture. They learned to manage the river's seasonal floods, constructing simple yet brilliant irrigation systems that directed water across the valley floor. Where others saw only sand and dust, they coaxed forth green shoots of hope: cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their most valuable resource. It was spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling trade with coastal settlements and forging connections that extended far beyond their desert home. But cultivating crops was only one aspect of their mastery. The people of Corral understood that survival in the desert depended on balance. They collaborated with nature, not against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designed to endure both the intense heat and the rare, severe rains that occasionally swept through the valley. They observed the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the lifeblood of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods moved up and down the coast. In return, Corral received exotic items: colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated, they were interconnected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Corral prospered through intelligence, innovation, and community. They did not conquer the desert by brute force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, and building a society that was not just functional, but extraordinary. Against all odds, Corral blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was only just beginning to rise. Rising from the desert like ancient sentinels, the pyramids of Corral challenge everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These were not small, primitive structures built by unskilled hands. They were massive, intentional works of architecture created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The focal point of the city was the Pyramid Mayor, the largest of Corral's monumental structures. It extended more than 450 feet in length and rose nearly 60 feet above the desert floor, a feat of engineering comparable to the early wonders of the ancient world. Constructed from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not only to withstand the harsh climate, but also to endure the powerful earthquakes that occasionally shook the region. And endure it did, standing silently against wind and time for almost 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Corral were not tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes of Egypt, Corral's pyramids had a different function. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces topped their summits, accessible by wide, elegant staircases. Fires once burned on these platforms, and rituals were conducted beneath the vast Peruvian sky. At the base of the pyramids, large plazas opened up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to congregate for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very layout of Corral's cityscape suggests a society that valued community and order, a people deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Surrounding the pyramids, smaller residential complexes spread out, likely housing priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves appear to have been strategically positioned, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, and the cycles of the stars. To the people of Corral, architecture was not just practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, and cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones today, it is almost impossible not to experience a strange sense of awe. These structures were erected without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they were built with symmetry, scale, and astounding precision. The Great Pyramids of Corral were not constructed for vanity or for war. They were built to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. And they still whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Corral, there is something profoundly distinct, something that differentiates it from so many other ancient civilizations. No weapons have been discovered buried beneath its sands. No defensive walls encircle its plazas. No mass graves suggest bloody conquests or internal conflict. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through warfare, Corral was a society founded on peace. It is a revelation that challenges expectations. Here was a civilization that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Corral seem to have directed their energy not into armies or fortresses, but into architecture, astronomy, music, and communal living. Their plazas and pyramids were not monuments to victory over adversaries. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than to conquer, to negotiate rather than to destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Corral's success. Cotton cultivated along the fertile riverbanks was spun into fishing nets that were traded with coastal communities. In return, Corral received dried fish, an essential source of protein, and exotic goods from distant places. Colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even rare tropical fruits from faraway valleys. This extensive network of trade connected the region, binding disparate communities into a peaceful web of mutual benefit, and at its center, Corral thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life played a crucial role in maintaining social harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas likely served as stages for rituals that united the people under shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert, connecting individual lives to something greater. Leadership, too, seems to have relied less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex trade agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal marks of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Corral stands as a remarkable exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to be built on the broken backs of the conquered. It can instead be constructed by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Corral, the stones still seem to resonate with echoes of a world long past. It was not just a city of buildings and commerce. It was a city vibrant with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were deeply embedded in the very core of Corral civilization. Archaeologists, carefully excavating through the dry sands, have uncovered a wealth of ancient instruments. Flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles made from deer antlers, and small drums covered with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple playthings. They were meticulously crafted, tuned to specific notes, and designed to carry sound across the wide, open plazas of the city. In a world without written language, music served as the language of the soul. Imagine it, the low throb of drums rising at dusk, flutes wailing like the desert wind, feet stomping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the fading light. Fires would have crackled atop the pyramid platforms. Priests dressed in intricately woven garments would have chanted to the gods of the river, the earth, and the stars. In those moments, Corral was not just a city, it was a symphony. The layout of Corral itself suggests that ritual life was central. The grand plazas were not merely open spaces, they were stages for communal ceremonies, carefully designed to bring people together. The sunken circular courts functioned like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their centers. And above them all, the pyramids stood, not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the changing of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvesting, and the movements of the stars. Music was not just entertainment, it was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. There are no violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world appears to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning, and connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Corral was not just a place of music, trade, and ritual. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. Without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals, the people of Corral created a city of stone and earth that has stood for nearly 5,000 years. Their accomplishments were remarkable. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous stones carried across the arid valley. Workers transported these rocks using reed bags, ingenious baskets strong enough to bear heavy loads, woven from the very plants that grew along the riverbanks. Layer upon layer, they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create structures that could withstand not only time, but also the fury of nature. And they understood nature well. Corral is located in a region prone to violent earthquakes, yet their pyramids and plazas have survived largely intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering born not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another silent achievement. Despite living in a desert, the people of Corral developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, allowing crops to thrive even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop was precious. The layout of Corral itself reflects brilliant urban planning. Major structures were aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of solar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were more than just gathering places. They were instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict the seasons, which was crucial for survival. Even the city's organization speaks of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative areas, and ceremonial centers were all arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred spaces. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Corral's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. Sometimes, the deepest wisdom lies in understanding the forces of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Corral stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Corral thrived, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires mark its decline, no signs of conquest scar its walls, no mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of sudden catastrophe. Instead, Corral simply faded away. Its plazas became empty. Its pyramids were left to the shifting sands. Its flutes and drums were silenced by time. Why did they depart? That question still hangs like a ghost over the Supi Valley. Some scholars suggest that environmental change delivered the final blow. Evidence indicates that a prolonged period of drought may have crippled Corral's agriculture. Without the life-giving waters of the river, the fields would have withered. Trade networks dependent on surplus cotton and food would have collapsed. The delicate balance that Corral had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond recovery. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and inland, Corral's influence might have waned. Perhaps the goods they once provided, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer sufficient to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce may have drained away. Still others speculate about internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure appears to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, and new beginnings. Children who once ran across Corral's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands, waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Corral lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Supa Valley. Travelers passed by the strange, rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It was not until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Corral's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supi Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, overshadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had independently developed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization long before the rise of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life. Musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipus, ancient knotted records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more, its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, and to remember. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that the roots of civilization stretch far deeper than we once imagined. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. A story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving the scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence, that greatness is not measured by the number of armies marching across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, and to dream. Corral's legacy extends far beyond the dry sands of the Supa Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the old world. Carroll proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, to celebrate, and to reach for the divine. Today, walking among Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the very bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under the sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.